What's up everyone and welcome to another YouTube video. In this video I'll break down the first match of the final of the Aimchess US Rapid between world champion Magnus Carlsen and Vladislav Artemiev from Russia. So both players made it to the final through some pretty tough matches. But let's jump right in and have a look at the game. So Artemiev was white in the first game and he started things off with the move 1c4, the English opening. Now there's many things black can do. Black can play e5, which is one of black's main responses. After which we get sort of a reversed Sicilian. But Magnus chose the move knight to f6, keeping his options open. He can still decide to play pawn e5 if white gives him that chance later on. But it also gives him options of playing, he can still play for a Slav defense or, more of a Queen's Gambit declined setup. Anyway, Artemiev plays knight f3 and Magnus plays the move c5, the symmetrical English. So Artemiev plays the move knight c3 and Magnus plays the move e6. Artemiev plays e3. Now both players are really trying to keep their options open in the first few moves of the game. So Magnus plays the move d5, creating tension in the center, and Artemiev plays the move d4. Now Magnus could have been a copycat here, played the move knight c6, but he had other plans. He played the move a6, and this move might seem a bit useless, but very often the point is that in case Artemiev would take, Magnus can recapture with the bishop, and now this bishop always has this nice little square on a7 where it can drop back to. Furthermore, if white were to take here, white does not have more annoying moves like bishop e5 check, so there is some merit to the move pawn to a6. Anyway, so Artemiev took on d5, Magnus recaptured, and Artemiev played the move g3. Now white's point is that in case black would play a move like knight c6, white wants to go bishop g2 and eventually take on c5 and play, let's make a move, let's say bishop e7, eventually wants to take here, and then start playing against the isolated pawn on d5, for which the bishop on g2 will be quite ideally placed because it's always putting pressure on that pawn. But Magnus had other ideas. After the move g3, he played the move c4, gaining space on the queen side, but also eliminating the option of ever taking on c5 and isolating his pawn on d5. So Artemiev plays bishop to g2 and Magnus plays bishop to b4. Now the idea of bishop e4 is that it makes it a lot harder for white to ever play the move e4, undermining the black center. So Artemiev plays bishop to d2, Magnus castles, Artemiev plays knight e5, and Magnus plays the move knight to c6. So he's offering to trade the knights. So Artemiev castles. Now black does not want to take the knight on e5, because after white recaptures, your knight on f6 is hit, and if you move the knight then you lose the pawn on d5, and this is no bueno. So instead of that, Magnus played the move rook e8, putting the rook on the half open file, but also putting pressure on the knight. So in case Artemiev would move the rook now he can take on e5 and he would win a pawn. So instead of that, Artemiev takes the knight on c6, Magnus recaptures. Now Magnus has double pawns, but the double pawns are doing a pretty good job. The pawn on c4 gives black quite a bit of space, and the pawn on c6 does a good job defending this pawn on d5. So the bishop on g2 isn't generating that much pressure. So Artemiev goes b3, putting pressure on the pawn on c4. And here Magnus finds a very nice idea. So Artemiev's idea is that in case black takes on b3, he wants to recapture the pawn. And now both the a6 and c6 pawns are backwards. And after he follows up with something like queen to c2 and rook fc1, both these pawns will be under pressure. Magnus comes up with a very nice idea. He plays the move a5. Now you all might be wondering, like, what is he doing? Like, isn't he just hanging this pawn? I mean, he can recapture, right? Because then white takes on c6 and he picks him at an exchange. But Magnus plays the move bishop to a6. A very nice idea. Now you can't really take on d5 because now I take your rook on f1 and black's up an exchange here. White is a pawn, but it does not have sufficient compensation. So instead of that, Artemiev plays the move queen to c2. Magnus recaptures the pawn and he moves his rook out of the way with rook f to b1. And here Magnus comes up with a very nice concept again. Now, A normal move would be something like queen e7, but here white would play the move knight a4, offering to trade the bishops, and after the trade he can start playing on these weak squares on c5 and b6. So Magnus makes a move that might be counterintuitive. He voluntarily gives up the bishop pair by bishop takes c3, and white recaptures. But the point is that this bishop on c3 is a bit passive because it's kind of stuck behind its own pawns. Well, the knight had a lot of active play, and here he follows up with knight e4. Now note that also the bishop on g2 is also a bit blunted because black has these solid pawns here. I mean, he can't really ever take on d5. And the bishop on c4 is doing a good job of blocking the c file. So the pawn on c6 isn't really weak either. Now Artemiev goes bishop to e1, keeping his bishop pair, and Magnus plays the move h5. So he's making his intentions clear. He wants to go h4 and soften up the white queen side. Now white can go h4 to stop that, but here my assumption is that Magnus wanted to play g5 and just try to break open the white king over here. He wants to follow that with h4, and suddenly white is starting to feel the heat. You can also go rook e6, rook g6, and black's position is pretty pleasant. So instead of that, Artemiev plays the move queen to d1, Magnus continues with h4, Artemiev plays g4, and Magnus plays the move a4. Now the point of this move is to make sure that this pawn on a5 is never hanging, and after Artemiev plays the move a3, now he plays the move bishop b3. So he wants to stop white from ever entering through the b file. Right, this rook on b1 is now blocked by this bishop on b3. So Artemiev plays the move queen e2, and Magnus plays rook e6. Now the rook on e6 is doing a very good job of defending the pawn on c6, but the rook can also slide over to g6, for example, and start attacking white on the king side. So Artemiev plays rook c1, Magnus brings out his queen with queen to g5. So Artemiev's like, GTFO, I'm going to play f4. Why don't you leave? But f4 does weaken this pawn on e3. Right, it's no longer defended by his body in f2, and Magnus is doubling up on the e file, so he can start generating pressure towards that pawn. Artemiev goes bishop b4, hitting the queen, and Magnus sidesteps with the move queen to c7. Now, here Artemiev goes f5, hitting the rook, and so Magnus moves the rook back, and Artemiev goes queen to e1, hitting the pawn on h4. Now, if Artemiev were to take that pawn, his king side would be a lot safer because the queen is controlling a lot of squares around over there. So Magnus plays the move queen d8. He wants to keep this h-pawn on the board because he wants to use it to try to annoy white over there. So Artemiev takes the pawn on c6, and now Magnus comes up with the move h3, hitting the bishop on g2. Now you might be wondering, like, isn't this just a free pawn? But the point is that Magnus wanted to play a move like queen g5, but now white can always play h3, and his king side is a lot more stable. Like, all the pawns are defending each other. Connect 3, right? So Magnus plays the move h3. Oh, h3. Artemiev takes a pawn, and Magnus plays queen g5. Now white cannot play bishop to g2 and h3 because that would hang the pawn in g2 in the process. So he can't do that. So his bishop on h3 is a little bit stuck, and it's not that easy for white to make a move. Like, black is threatening to go knight f6, and some variations hitting the pawn on g4 and hitting this pawn on e3. So Artemiev goes queen e2, preemptively defending this pawn, and Magnus goes rook a to c8, trying to challenge the c file. And Magnus is taking some risk here. He sacrificed 2 pawns. But at this point, Artemiev was already starting to get low on the clock, and the position is pretty complicated, and he made a big mistake here. In this position, he should have traded the rooks on c8 and gone bishop to g2. Just bring the bishop back. Black can go rook to c2, which is what Artemiev was probably worried about. Now you have to go queen f3, you have to keep guarding this pawn, and you have to keep guarding this pawn. And black still has a lot of compensation after someone like bishop c4, trying to go bishop e2 and put pressure on his pawn in g4. But white can play someone like queen f4, offering the trade of queens. And even though black's pieces are pretty active, white is still up 2 pawns. So white should still be better, but black probably has enough resources to make a draw. But instead of that, Artemiev made a big mistake. He played the move rook a to c1, which allows the move bishop to c4. Now Magnus is blocking the connection between these rooks, and so white can take here, but after black recaptures, I mean the rook is still hanging, so you would have to take, and white's in very bad shape here. Because still he has a ton of weaknesses around here, and now black can also start pushing this pawn forward. And know that you cannot use your queen to guard, because that would hang the pawn on e3 always. So instead of that, Artemiev takes on c8, and Magnus takes, and he takes on e8. So he gives up the queen for two rooks, but the problem is that now his king is way too weak. So Magnus sidesteps with the king, and he goes bishop d2, protecting the pawn on e3. Now Magnus should not take the bishop on d2, because now white goes rook to c8, suddenly creating this checkmate threat. The only way for black to escape the checkmate is the move g6, but here white can take on g6 with the pawn. Now you should not take this pawn if you take with the queen. Whites can give a check, king over check, and you lose the queen. If you lose with the king, you lose your queen right away. And if you take with the pawn, this is even worse, white gives a check. And if you step up, this is checkmate. So instead of that, black should play king g7, but here white can play the move g takes f7. Now, you can give a check, but it does not do a whole lot. I just sidestep with the king. If you take an e3, well, that's protected by the rook. White's trying to make a queen, and if you take, then white's going to keep on giving checks on the 8th rank. Once again, you don't want to go here because you lose your queen, and if you go here, I keep checking. And if you go here, I can give a check. And you can take the rook, but now white can give a check with the bishop, and if you would have to step back, then white's going to take. And even though the two rooks are gone, white has a lot of pawns here. So after someone like bishop to e6, hitting the pawn, now this pawn starts rolling as well. White should be able to hold the balance, because he has 1, 2, 3 pawns for the knight. So once again, you should not take the bishop. Funny little variation. I'm sure Magnus did not even consider that. Instead of that, he took the pawn on g4. He wants to go after the king. And the queen and knight combo is very deadly against the king, because they both move in different ways, right? The queen moves straight and diagonally, or actually let's point it towards the king, straight and diagonally. Well, the knight moves in this weird L shape, right? So it makes a really nice combination. So if white takes here, well, this is not going to end well. You're just getting destroyed. So instead of that, Artemiev blocked with the bishop, and now came the move bishop f3, and you cannot stop checkmate. So Magnus wins the first game, very complicated game. I think he did a good job of creating complications while also keeping a nice time advantage on the clock. And eventually Artemiev collapsed. So let's have a look at game 2. In game 2, Magnus starts things off with the move 1 d4. Artemiev plays d5. And he plays the queen's gambit with c4. And Artemiev declines it with the move e6. The names are off here, but I hope you guys can live with that. So Magnus plays the move knight c3, and Artemiev plays the move c5, going for a Tarrasch. That is pretty similar as what we saw in game 1. Magnus took, Artemiev recaptured, and here Magnus made a bit of a weird decision. He decided to take on c5. Now the main move here is the move knight f3, because you want to take here eventually, but you want to stop black from going pawn at d4. So black would usually play something like knight f6, and there's a bunch of options here. You can play bishop g5, pinning the knight and putting pressure on this pawn that way. Or, once again, there's the move g3, fianchettoing your bishop and putting pressure on the pawn that way. But instead of that, Magnus takes a pawn, but this allows the move pawn at d4, hitting the knight, and you would have to move your knight, so this is slightly awkward. So Magnus plays the move knight a4, and here Artemiev plays the move b5. Now this knight on a5 might look trapped, right? It cannot move here, after which it would get taken with the pawn. Cannot move here because it gets taken. But guess what? If you have been playing chess for a while, you know of this move, en croissant. No, it's not a glitch, because this pawn sort of ditched this pawn on c5 over here. You have this little trick where you can actually take it. So Artemiev recaptures and Magnus plays the move b3, creating this little square for his knight. So Artemiev goes b5, hitting the knight b2, and Artemiev gives a check, which is a slight mistake, because he's down a pawn, and Magnus plays bishop d2, and here you kind of have to trade the bishops, but if you're down a pawn, you want to keep pieces on the board, especially minor pieces. So I think instead of that, you should have played a move like knight f6, just developing, or knight c6, after which the game is still pretty complicated. Magnus up a pawn, but it's not that easy to get his pieces out. So, but after check, bishop d2, they traded, and now he played the move knight f6. So Black's idea is pretty easy. He wants the castle, and then play knight e4 quickly, hitting the queen. Right, let's make a couple moves. In case White were to play something like knight f3, Black would first have to go knight c6, defending this pawn. But the problem for White is that if you play something like e3, Black has this very nasty move knight e4, hitting the queen. And if you sidestep, well, guess what? There's the move queen a5. And this check is very unpleasant, because you don't want to go here, because suddenly you're just getting absolutely smoked. Or your king is stuck in the middle. This knight can also start jumping in, and this is no bueno. So instead of that, Magnus came up with a very nice move. He played the move e4. Now, you might be like, wait, but e4, Black can take en croissant, but that doesn't really do too much. You don't always want to go for en croissant. Right here, White can just take and then take the pawn on e3. So this isn't really, like, en croissant is not always a good move. I mean, come on. But instead of that, Artemiev took the pawn on e4. Might be wondering, like, why didn't he just hang a pawn, right? We saw this. If he sidesteps, then queen to a5. What is Magnus doing? But he takes the pawn on b5 with a check. So Artemiev blocked with the move bishop to d7. And now Magnus could have just taken the pawn on d4. But things are not so simple, because Black can give a check. If you block, then Black takes. So if you take this knight on e4, everything looks great, right? You're checking the king. You're also hitting the rook. But here Black plays the move king d8. And you might be like, wait, what? Can I just take the rook? But the problem is that here Black plays the move rook e8 check. And suddenly you find yourself in a lot of trouble. White does not have a good way to block. I mean, knight e2 allows checkmate. Don't do that. And if you go king to d2, well, then your king is also pretty exposed, because Black has the queen, the bishop, and the rook to go after you. So here you're just getting checkmated. If you go something like king c2, there's someone like bishop f5, knight d3, and something like queen c4, and everything is starting to collapse. After queen b2, Black can give a check here, and he wants to force your king to a square where Black will be able to pick up the knight with a check. So if you go here, Black can take with the knight with a check. If you go here, he also takes with a check, and if you go here, Black gives a check on c3 once again, forcing you to go here, and now Black takes, and you're just getting checkmated, right? So White should not go for that. So Magnus made the right decision of not taking that pawn on d4 and allowing this queen a5 check. So he played the move queen to b4, which also had some risk. The best move was in fact taking on d7. Now, if Black takes with the knight, now you can take on d4 because there's no bishop hanging after check b4. And Black can take with the queen, but now you can go queen c2, hitting the knight on e4, and there's no queen a5 check once again. So now White has time to go knight f3 and castle, after which he should be safe. And he's up a pawn, so it's really up to Black to prove the compensation. So instead of the Magnus played queen b4, Artemiev played the move knight c3. Magnus traded on d7, Artemiev recaptured, and he went king of 1. Not ideal, but once again, if you go knight f3, which is the move you want to make, black plays a move like knight c6, hitting your queen. And if you go queen c4, then black can give an annoying check. You have to move the king here, and now black castles, and you're kind of stuck over here. Black has a lot of compensation. He has pressure on the a2 pawn. He can move the rook here, for example. The queen is almost trapped. So instead of that, Magnus preemptively played king of 1. And the difficult thing for black is that black's king is also stuck, because white is stopping it from castling. But also, by playing king of 1, Magnus enables the move rook e1, check. So Artemiev goes knight c6, Magnus gives a check. So Artemiev has to play the move king to d8. And now Magnus gives another check, Artemiev plays queen c7. Now it might seem tempting to trade the queens here, because you go into an endgame, you're up a pawn, but after you trade, black still has a lot of activity. This pawn on a2 is difficult to defend, so white's still under a lot of pressure. So Magnus played the move Magnus played the move queen to c5, keeping queens on the board. Artemiev took an a2, and Magnus played knight to d3. So once again, the game is pretty complicated. Artemiev played rook e8, a good move. Magnus played knight f3. He had to get this knight developed, and now he can recapture with the f3 knight on e1. So Artemiev goes rook a5, good move, hitting the queen. Magnus plays queen c4, backing up the queen. Artemiev takes. Magnus takes with the d knight on e1, so he keeps this pressure on the pawn on d4. Artemiev plays queen d7, and up to here Artemiev had been playing a really good game. He's actually better because the rook on h1 is kind of stuck, which is Magnus's problem. So he goes, and at the same time all of black's pieces are pretty active. Right, this rook on a5 is much more active than the rook on h1. So Magnus plays h4, he wants to try to include his rook in the game this way. And here Artemiev should have played the move rook h1. Pinning the knight on e1, which has a tough time moving out, and white's in a really tough spot. Right, you're still pinned all over the place, but instead of that, Artemiev plays queen d5, and Magnus plays rook h3. So Artemiev here traded the queens, and here he's starting to let Magnus off the hook, because he was kind of stuck, but now the white pieces are also moving, and he goes rook a4. Going after the pawn on c4, but here Magnus had a nice little tactic. He took the pawn on d4. So the problem is that, I mean, it might seem like white's hanging a knight, but he's removing the defender of the knight on c3. So in case black recaptures, you take on c3, and suddenly white's up a pawn. So now white's playing for the win. So Artemiev takes the pawn on c4, but here Magnus does not want to trade. If you trade, this should just be a draw. But Magnus plays the move knight f5, and now there are suddenly a lot of problems for black. This pawn on g7 is under attack, but furthermore, white is also threatening this move knight to d6. So Artemiev plays pawn on g6, but here he missed Magnus's other idea, the move knight d6, and suddenly black is just lost. The rook on c4 is under attack. You cannot go here, because suddenly white can take a pawn, but there's even better, there's knight b7, creating this little fork, picking up a rook. And if you go to d4, putting the knight under attack, white does not want to take here, because you're taking your knight on c6 to defend it. But instead of that, white takes the pawn on f7, and after black goes here, now you take on c3. And if you take the knight on f7, I take your knight on c6, I'm up a knight, and black is just lost. So very unfortunate game for Artemiev. He played really well, but he just blundered. He just let Magnus off the hook, and then at the end he blundered. So very unfortunate game for him. So Magnus takes the lead 2-0. So he only needs a draw there to win the match. Now in the third game, Artemiev once again starts things off with the move 1c4. Magnus once again plays the move knight f6, knight f3, and c5. So we have the same start the first game, but here Artemiev deviates with the move g3. So Magnus plays knight c6, bishop g2, and pawn to d5. So Artemiev takes, Magnus recaptures, knight c3, and black plays g6. So this is more of a Grunfeld setup. For those of you who don't know, the Grunfeld is where after d4, black plays knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and d5. So you combine the move d5 with fianchettoing your bishop, right? So that's what I'm referring to here. d5 is played, but you also play the move g6, putting your bishop on this long diagonal. So here, white can continue quietly with someone like short castle, bishop g7, but the game is pretty dry. Black has a pretty good position here. So Artemiev has other ideas. He goes for the move h4. And Magnus can still play bishop g7, but here white wants to go h5. And this pawn is pretty annoying over here. If you decide to castle, then there are a lot of ideas of taking and queen a4. And you just want to swing the queen over and then queen h7, and suddenly your king can get in a lot of danger. So instead of that, Magnus plays the move h6. So his point is that if white were to play h5, he can now play g5, and his pawn is not hanging because it's defended by this pawn over here. So Artemiev castles. So he's trying to argue that this inclusion of the move h4, h6 is favorable for him. And the main rationale behind that is that very often after the move d3, this pawn on h6 can be hanging in some variations. So Magnus goes bishop g7, d3 is played, and Magnus plays bishop e6, continuing his development. So Artemiev goes bishop to d2, b6 is played by Magnus. So here we see that if Magnus were to castle, then there are some tricky variations with knight takes d5. You can take with the queen, but now white has the move knight g5, hitting your queen, and white gets the bishop pair. If black were to go here, this is not the end of the world, but the bishop pair does give white a nice advantage. This bishop on g2 is especially pretty active. And if you take with the bishop, there's the move queen to c1, hitting the pawn on h6 and hitting the pawn on c5. So Magnus plays b6 preemptively, defending this pawn, and Artemiev plays the move a3, rook c8 and rook c1. Both sides are improving their pieces. So Magnus castles, and here Artemiev decides to trade. Once again, you don't want to take with the queen because then comes the move knight g5, hitting the queen, and white gets the bishop pair with a small advantage. Instead, Magnus takes with the bishop, and now white plays the move b4, which was the idea of the move a3, because you want to chip away of black's space advantage on the queen side. So Magnus can take, but this gives white a slightly favorable pawn structure. You can go b5, for example, putting the knight under pressure, or queen a4, putting this pawn on a7 under pressure. So Magnus plays the move knight d4. Now here, white can take on c5, but the problem is that here black has moves like bishop e3, which are annoying, because you would have to go queen e1, and black can go knight to c2. And you can go queen e1, but now you're in this nasty discovery. Now, keep in mind that Magnus only needed the draw, so you could just go knight d4 and make the draw. And if you don't want to draw, you would have to give up the exchange, but black's not really risking anything here. White only has one pawn. So Artemiev decided that this knight on d4 cannot stay on the board, so he decided to take it. Magnus took on g2. You cannot take on d4 because white takes here. You were captured, but now you're no longer defending the bishop on d5. So white just wins a piece. So he trades on g2, and now Artemiev comes up with a tricky little move. If you take on g2 right now with your king, black just takes here, and the position is approximately equal. Right, both sides only have, they have both the rooks, but they only have one minor piece on the board. And black has more space in the center. He'll follow it with a move like queen to d5, and black's not really risking anything here. So Artemiev comes up with a tricky move. He plays the move knight e6. Now you might be thinking, like, hey, I can just take this knight, right? But after white takes now you have all these ugly pawns. So now white has something to play for, right? White has a better pawn structure. So that's white's point. So instead of that, Magnus goes queen to d7. And here you might be thinking, wait, but Benjamin, isn't he just hanging the rook on f8? Because it's hitting the queen. If you recapture, now I take your bishop and you're down a full rook. But the problem is that if you take the rook on f8, Magnus has this move queen h3, and suddenly he's threatening checkmate. So you'd have to play f3, which is not really what you want to do. Black can take here, and suddenly your king is in a lot of danger. Right, this bishop can also come in with bishop d4, or if you go bishop e1, that's you're getting checkmated. Because if you block now, this queen is no longer hanging. You can go bishop h3, king over, and queen g2, checkmate. So both sides are trying to be very sneaky here. Note that black could not play the move queen d5, defending this bishop this way, because white has knight f4, forking the queen and the bishop. And if black plays queen d6, now white would take the rook. So queen d7 was a very nice find by Magnus. So Artemiev decides to take the bishop, Magnus has to take the knight, and now Artemiev takes on c5. So at least he's gained something, because after Magnus takes here, he takes, Magnus recaptures, so at least black has this isolated pawn over here. But the problem for white is that this pawn on e2 is also still under attack. So white would like to make a move like queen a4, putting this pawn under pressure, followed up by rook c1, bishop e3, and everything is good. But once again, the problem is that this pawn is hanging. So instead of that, Artemiev plays bishop e3, hitting the pawn and blocking this threat. But now Magnus plays c4. He's in time to get rid of his isolated pawn. So Artemiev takes, Magnus recaptures. You can take the pawn on a7, but the problem is that black plays a move like queen a6, hitting the bishop on a7 and hitting the pawn on a3. You cannot play bishop c5 defending the pawn, because now black has check, and you lose your bishop on c5, after which you lose the game. So after queen a6, this would just end in a draw, because after white moves the bishop, black takes on a3, and there's not much left to play for. So instead of that, Artemiev goes queen d2, hitting the pawn on h6. So Magnus plays a6. Now you might be wondering, isn't he just hanging a pawn? But the problem is if white takes it, black can take. And now this pawn on e2 is hanging once again. So instead of that, Artemiev goes rook c1, hitting the queen. Magnus gives a check, king g1, and he goes rook to b8. Once again, you cannot take, because the pawn on e2 is hanging, and black keeps the balance. So instead of that, Artemiev plays queen a5. And here, Magnus had a very unfortunate moment. This might be the main reason why some of you guys clicked on the video. I hope you guys just didn't skip through all the way to this point. So here, Artemiev is attacking the pawn on a6. So a very normal move, and it's what Magnus planned to play, was the move queen e6, defending the pawn laterally. But unfortunately for him, he mouse slipped and he played the move queen e5, and now, well, white can just take the pawn, and white suddenly has his pawn past a pawn. The bishop also does a nice job of supporting that push, so it suddenly becomes very tough for black to defend. He goes king to h7, sidestepping any potential checks on the back rank. Artemiev goes bishop f4, hitting the queen and the rook. So Magnus goes queen b5. Now you cannot take the rook because you lose your queen. And after the queen trade, now this rook is no longer hanging. So Artemiev follows up with the move rook c7, a very good move, putting this pawn under pressure, and there's no real comfortable way for black to defend it. Magnus goes g5, hitting the bishop. So Artemiev trades, but now he goes bishop e3. Once again, this bishop is pretty strong in this diagonal because it's always supporting the pawn if it would come up all the way to a7. So Magnus goes king g6. Artemiev could just decide to take the pawn here. I don't know why he didn't do that. I think it was just a free pawn, but he decided not to. He played the move a4. This is also really good, just pushing this pawn forward. If black goes rook a5, now there's rook a7. And this bishop endgame is lost because this pawn is just going to push through. Furthermore, this pawn on g5 is always a weakness if I drop the bishop back. So Magnus wants to keep the rooks on the board. He goes rook b2, hitting the pawn. But Artemiev just goes a5, sacrificing the pawn. Now, if you were to take here, white plays a6, and this is what I was referring to earlier. Bishop on e3 does a really good job of defending this pawn over here. Also, black cannot play bishop d4. So next up, white's just going to play rook c8 and then a8, and there's nothing black can do to stop that. You're just losing your rook for the pawn, and the game is just lost. So instead of that, Magnus played the move rook a2. He gave a check with the rook, king f5, a6. So once again, white just wants to push forward, go rook c8 and make a new queen. So Magnus plays king e4, a7, and bishop d4 at least, trading off the bishops. But now white just takes and goes rook c7, defending the pawn, but he's also picking up another pawn in the process. Magnus played g4, but without waiting for probably rook takes c7, he resigned. He realized that this endgame down 2 pawns, he has no chance of defending. So due to that very unfortunate mouse slip of Magnus, we did get to see a 4th game today. So Magnus only needs to draw in this game. So he starts things off with e4, and so he has faith that even though the move e4 is usually one of the more aggressive moves, he has faith that he can keep the game under control and not get into much risk. So Artemiev plays the move c5, going for the Sicilian, a very logical choice. He wants to make it as sharp as possible. Magnus plays knight f3, d6 was played by Artemiev, and now the main move here for white is the move d4, going into the open Sicilian. But this can lead to pretty sharp lines. For example, the knight off, which was one of Artemiev's main weapons, is known to get pretty sharp, and black can get a pretty complex game with, still all pieces on the board, which is what he's looking for in a must-win game. But Magnus has other plans. He plays the move bishop b5, which is a move he very often plays, and it's a move that enables white to get a more solid game. So Artemiev blocks with a knight, and Magnus plays the move a4. One of the new main lines against this knight e7 move. Black goes knight f6, white played knight to c3, defending the pawn, and Artemiev played g6, planning to fianchetto the bishop. And here Magnus played the move a5, gaining more space on the queen side. Now the annoying thing for black is that if you ever play the move a6, hitting the bishop, white just drops back, and you can play b5, but white's always gonna take it en croissant, and you will have this isolated pawn on a6. So, and if you do not play e5, you're kind of stuck here, because the bishop on c8 is kind of stuck. You would have to move the knight to get the bishop developed. So Artemiev plays bishop g7, Magnus castles, and here Magnus plays the move a6. Once again, he wants to soften up the black queen side. You don't want to play b6 here, because that allows bishop c6, hitting the rook. And if you sidestep, then there might be the move knight b5, hitting the pawn on a7, which is pretty annoying for black. So he decided not to do that. But instead of that, he took, but now Magnus takes. And this is sort of exactly what Magnus was looking for. He wasn't necessarily trying to force the draw straight out of the opening, but he just wanted to get a position where he felt pretty safe, right? Because after the trade, white doesn't have any real weaknesses. Everything is nice and solid, but black does have this pawn on a7, which can always be a bit weak. So Artemiev goes knight b8, hitting the rook. Magnus drops back, knight c6, Magnus goes d3, queen b6, and b3. Just playing the fianchetto his bishop, neutralizing this bishop on the long diagonal. So Artemiev goes knight d7, bishop e2, and queen b7. And here Magnus goes queen a1. Once again, he wants to get pressure on this pawn on a7. And I would say here is the only move where Artemiev really missed a chance to at least try to complicate the game. I think the move he should have played to try to generate any chances is the move f5. Because very often this exchange sack on f3 comes into position, and it's really what he should have played to try to get a complicated game. But instead he went a5. But here Magnus went knight e5. He was like, alright, let's just try to trade everything off. So Artemiev took, Magnus recaptured, played a4. So he is getting rid of his isolated pawn. You cannot take because that hangs your queen. Don't do that. So Magnus played queen c1, but after he played e6, kicking the knight away, knight e3. But after this trade, I mean, he got rid of his isolated pawn, but the structure is pretty symmetrical, and it's really difficult for black to ever generate chances. He went queen c7, queen b2. Once again, Magnus makes it very clear. He just wants to trade everything off. Wants to go rook a1. Artemiev plays rook fb8, at least trying to contest the open b file. Magnus took. Artemiev recaptured. Queen c3. Artemiev played knight d5, but this is exactly what Magnus wants. He just traded, putting the rook on the open file. Knight c6. He played queen f6. Now black has to be careful here. You want to make a move like knight e4, but here suddenly you run into knight g4, and this knight h6 will be pretty nasty to deal with, because let's say you take the pawn. White can sidestep first with the rook, but after that you cannot stop knight here. If you were to move the knight back, white gives a check, and your king's in a lot of danger. White can just give a check, pick up this pawn here. White's king is perfectly safe, while black's king is under a lot of pressure. So instead of that, after the move queen f6, Artemiev played queen d8, but once again Magnus just traded. He recaptured. He played rook a6, hitting the knight on c6. The knight stepped forward. Magnus played rook b6, but once again, both sides only have a rook and a knight on the board. There aren't really too many resources in the position. So Artemiev played d5, takes. Now if he gets one more move, let's say white plays h3, goes d4, hitting the knight, and if the knight moves, he takes the pawn on c2, after which black is up a pawn, so he has real winning chances here. But Magnus found a very nice move, d4. Now, putting pressure here, and it might look like you're just hanging a pawn, but after black takes here, your knight on b4 is hanging. So Artemiev took, Magnus recaptured, and it's clear that the game is just headed for a draw. He played rook c8, Magnus played rook b5, Artemiev took, took d5, king g7, king f1. Once again, even if this pawn on e3 was gone, the game would just be a draw. You cannot win a 3 versus 2, but you especially cannot win a 3 versus 3. So Magnus played rook d7, h5, h4, king e6, rook a7. I'm just going through the last moves pretty quickly because the game is just heading for a draw and there's not really much both players could do. f6, rook g7, king f5, e4. Some nice moves here by Magnus. He's just forcing the draw right away. King takes e4, takes g6, king f5, rook h6. King went here, chopped off another pawn, gave a check. Rook f3, going for the third rank defense. I'm just kidding, everything draws here. Rook c4, king f2, rook f4, and now we see a nice little gestures by both the players. They really played it out to the bare kings. And so Magnus gets the first win. But Artemiev had a lot of chances, so that should give him hope for tomorrow's match. I think his main problem was that he got too low on the clock in many games, and he blundered as a result of that. So yeah, Magnus gets the first win. If he ties tomorrow's match, he wins the Aimchess US Rapid. But yeah, we'll see tomorrow if Artemiev will manage to bounce back or if Magnus is once again gonna win it all. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe. I'd really appreciate it if you do. Also leave a like, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.